Thank you. It's nice to be back in Manchester, which involved my only participation in war. I was born in the cellar of Ashton-under-Lyne Hospital, and family lore is it was the last German bombardment of Manchester. Since then, I've had no direct experience of war, but I tend to, many sociologists write about themselves, their ethnic group, their gender, etc. I write about anything but myself, and I am interested in understanding things that I find very difficult to understand, like wars. Well, I'm going to be making three main points, and here they are. So the wars are ubiquitous, they're not universal, which means they're not genetically hardwired into humans, or indeed into men only. They appeared after about 90% of human existence on Earth, that is, about 90%, before states and social stratification, were predominantly peaceful. There's some dispute about it, but I'm on the side of people who say there was no significant war. Also, there are far more years of peace than war. But wars are more exciting and they're more recorded. Ancient annals, modern media focus intensively on wars because they're exciting, whereas peace is just tomorrow like today. So it's I'm kind of, in a way, downplaying the importance of war, but at the same time, wars have been important in developing what we call civilizations. And all of the major civilizations were established through wars, where one state or one group dominates over those around it by means of war. Now, I'm going to be saying, secondly, that wars are mostly irrational in terms of means, ends, or both. And that's because decisions for war blend alongside a kind of rational calculation. Ideology, emotions, domestic politics, and variable baked-in culture and institutions. And I'll explain what that means later. In fact, very few wars pay. Thirdly, war and peace decisions are overwhelmingly made by rulers under entourages, not large bodies of the people. And this is true not only in monarchies and oligarchies, but in democracies too, as I'll show. There's a reason for this. It's that foreign policy does not interest the majority of the people, and interest has two meanings here. First, they don't have any vested interest, or they think they don't have any vested interest abroad. And obviously here, pressure groups, in particular ethnic allegiances or manufacturing companies which have resources, have mines and things elsewhere, they will be exceptional. They will put pressure on the entourages. But also, people are just not interested in foreign policy. So, not peoples, not states, but rulers make war. Now, what I based my argument on, sets of data. The first is what's called the correlates of war, statistical data, collected by scientists, on wars since 1816, that date being the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and where you can have reasonably extensive quantitative data on the number of wars, the number of casualties, etc. Now, that project defines war as 1,000 battlefield deaths in a single year, and I'll make the point that that's heavily biased against colonial and proxy wars. My second source of data is very broad historical data on virtually all areas where there have been well-documented wars. They have to be well-documented, and I'm interested in wars as sequences and not individual cases. And that means that though my scope is almost global, that there's nothing, or virtually nothing, on Africa in this, because of the lack of data, historical data. Well, these are the cases that I've examined: the Roman Republic, and not the empire that followed it, ancient and imperial China, Japan from the medieval to the modern period, Europe for a millennium, and pre-colonial South and Central America, meaning pre-colonial means peoples like the Aztecs and the Inca, and post-colonial means the wars between the newly formed Spanish and Portuguese states of Latin America. And finally, I deal with the USA from the Civil War to today. And I'm focusing here on wars of aggression. There are obviously many different types of war, but I'm focusing on cases where we can clearly see that one side aggressive. Realism is the dominant theory in political science of wars. It has two main concepts: anarchy and rationality. Anarchy means there's no law in international space. All states, countries, have some kind of law domestically. Even if it's just the will of the ruler, there is law, whereas there is no fixed law internationally. There's proof of that going on at the moment, that though there is notionally a law that civilians should not be targeted in wars, this is happening in two current wars. So anarchy is okay, though it tends to neglect domestic politics. But rationality is the main thrust of realism, and I'm going to be attacking that. There are two kinds of realists. There are defensive realists who argue that states prioritize survival, and they calculate the best means of surviving. Aggressive realists focus on aggression, calculate the economic and strategic profit set against the cost of lives, human lives, and the cost of treasure, and finally the likelihood of victory. Now, there are 5 different metrics involved there, and it's difficult to set against rational. It is difficult to set number of lives lost against some kind of profit from war. But anyway, political scientists have done it. There is one statistic which often is not involved, and that is the loss of lives, because few rulers are risking their own lives they're desk killers, they're old men sending out young men to face possible death. Now, aggressive realism can be examined in various ways, but there is one simple kind of test of it, which is, do the aggressor win? Now, they won't win all the time because of the uncertainties of war. As Wellington said, you don't know what's on the other side of the hill. So we wouldn't expect them all to win, but one would expect a substantial number to. Well, the Correlates of War study, 4 people have produced data in different historical periods. And these studies average a 50% success rate. Okay, the other 50% is being defeated or in getting involved in a war of attrition which has no benefits to anyone. Now, that seems to me to be not enough to justify aggressive realism, because people are getting it wrong. Rulers are getting it wrong half the time. Because don't forget, these are aggressors who deliberately start a war. Okay? And of course, von Clausewitz said war was a gamble, and battle was uncertain, it was a risk. Well, I've got some data from my other cases. In Latin American post-colonial wars, the aggressors lost 6 wars, won 2, and there were 5 costly stalemates. In Song China, Song Dynasty China, there were 7 wars of aggression. They won 2, lost 4, and there was 1 costly stalemate. And of course, the Song dynasty was overthrown by the Mongols, well, so that wasn't a very successful dynasty in terms of war, though they tried to make it and tried to aggress. Now, we can look at persistent winners and ask, well, how come they got it right? So Rome, the Roman Republic, obviously very successful in wars, which were almost all wars, expanding Roman territories. And 2 of the Chinese dynasties, the Wang and the Qing. But the reason that they were so successful is that they had a different form of calculation. They were so successful because they were willing to sacrifice more than the enemy, because they had developed militaristic culture and institutions. And militarism pervaded Roman political institutions, for example. Anyone who wanted high political office had to have served in the legions for 7 years. And all the senators had fought as soldiers, as generals, even Cicero. Compare that to their major threat, the Carthaginians. Hannibal went into Italy, had some victories over the Romans. The Roman response was to form more legions and more legions, whereas at a point, Carthage's rulers recalled Hannibal and said, we're sacrificing too much. Was their undoing. And that's also true of these 2 Chinese dynasties, that they were willing to sacrifice more. And it was obviously true of the Mongols. Now, as far as I know, there are no systematic statistics for European history. It would be very difficult to calculate the large number of small states that the medieval period started with. Evan Luard has written a book about it, and he concludes that most feudal rulers lost because their calculations were undermined by status, honor, and domestic politics, and by the inability of the ruler to figure out how many people were going to turn up when he asked for support in a war. Couldn't predict how many of his lords would turn up with their retinues. And wars were often about honor and about domestic political politics. Henry V, he of Shakespeare glory, he was a young man. He just inherited the throne, and he was considered to be a weak young man. And so he set off for war in France. And indeed, he wasn't. In the wars of succession in monarchies, that is when there's a disputed succession, there's only one victor and more than one loser, generally. And of course, we have the examples of World War I and World War II, where the aggressors comprehensively lost. There are exceptions to this. There are two exceptions. One is what I call sharks versus minnows. That is, if a great power attacks a very minor power, they will predictably win. They almost do in that case. So that if we think of the US since World War II, we think of the US in Grenada or Panama, no problem. That's the shark swallowing up a minnow. But the US hasn't been at all successful since 1945 in bigger wars. Stalemate in Korea, losses in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. But the second exception is proxy wars. And that's what the Cold War was about. That is that the United States and the Soviet Union did not confront each other. They fought through intermediaries. So no Soviet or American alliance were lost. But they achieved or not their objectives. Indeed, we can see, I'll come back to this at the end, there's a proxy war being fought by the United States in the Ukraine. No American casualties, but massive aid to the Ukraine. What we find among aggressors is a systematic overconfidence. That is, they think that they're going to win when the chances of their winning are only 50-50. They had all expected to win. Why? Now I switch to defensive realism. Now, if rulers rationally pursue survival, one would assume that they tend to survive. But a very large majorities have not survived. In my cases, starting off with 70 plus states, I mean at least 70, one becomes the Chinese empire that we know in history. 16th century Japan, there were over 200 little statelets. By the end of the century, in only 100 years, there was only one left, what we know of as Japan. In Europe, 300 plus states were down to around about 30 by 1900. The primary cause of extinction in three studies, which are less, these studies are less than ideal, but they actually all showed the same thing, that defeat in battle is the primary cause of the non-survival of states, followed by submission to the threat of war, and then in third place, voluntaristic marriage and inheritance contracts. A ruler without an heir will make an agreement with a much larger neighbor to protect his subjects. Though in this respect, pre-Columbia America is different, because the Inca and the Aztec, despite their reputations, didn't fight as much, and their empires were formed more through threats, but also through intermarriage. Marry one heir with an heiress and the other state, etc. So again, we find over-optimism by the defense. Well, who is making the choice? And this is returning to the second point. Of course, the choice to use military power rather than economic, ideological, or political power, which are perfectly reasonable ways of achieving a goal, is what we're examining here. But choice is, of course, constrained by traditions. Okay? Now, in the Roman Republic, new consuls are not likely to choose peace rather than war, because that's not what consuls do. Of course, in monarchies and authoritarian regimes, the choice is made by the ruler and the entourage. The people are largely irrelevant, but they do indirectly constrain their rulers, who face the possibility that war, if it lasts, will produce higher taxes and further conscription, military conscription. And many of them hesitate to go to war for that reason. But democracies are quite similar. The executive power takes decision, whatever the Constitution says. Again, the people lack interest in foreign relations, and they're manipulable by the executive for, well, an average for about 2 years, and then after that they begin to ask questions, and if the war hasn't been won, and there might be some discontent expressed. So this is not an attack on democracy. Democracy is fine for domestic policies, even though, of course, electorates often make bizarre choices there too, but they are mobilized to demand certain things. But this isn't true of foreign policy. Now, the extreme is actually now going on. In 2001, the Authorization to Use Military Force Act in the United States allowed the president to go to war independently of Congress. The Senate should, on the Constitution, decide war or peace decisions, but that hasn't happened. Indeed, by 2018, this act had been used by the presidents 41 times in 19 countries. Okay? That's almost 2 a year. Now, of course, in the UK, the decision is made by Parliament, but the Prime Minister can normally manipulate, and the example of Tony Blair in Iraq is a good one. Now we turn to motives and the role of rationality in that. rulers are constrained by domestic politics. That is, if they have to maintain their honor and their dignity, and they mustn't appear weak, they mustn't appear to back down, and these are important issues in domestic politics because there are always alternative rulers. There's always the threat that some group will overthrow the existing rulers. So they have to be worried by that, and they often start wars in order to demonstrate their strength. And there's also culture and institutions. And war is baked in to some societies so that they are much more likely to choose aggression than others. If we think about Rome, or the ones I mentioned, the Mongols, we think of Prussia in modern Europe, and then, of course, the US since 1945. Of course, some wars are driven directly by religion or race or political ideologies. The 30 Years' War devastated Germany in the 17th century, Protestants against Catholics for the most part. And there are racial wars and political ideologies, of which World War II is a striking example, fascism against capitalist democracy. Well, there's something very general about human beings involved here, and that is, there's here a mistake in the slide, because Pascal did not say God of the gaps. 19th century theologians did. And what they meant was that we can't have certain knowledge of the world, and this is in response to the growing role of science, of course, as some people seeing it as an alternative to religion. But we can't have complete knowledge. We don't know the meaning of life. We struggle with the notion of death, so we'll have after death things like heaven and the like, or rebirth, and values. It's very difficult to find kind of scientific justification for them. But indeed, it is ideology, values, and emotions which fill in the gaps. And they fill in the gaps, and they permit confidence and action amid conditions of uncertainty, which wars always are. So that in order to act, human beings need things other as well as rationality. And then we come to over-optimism. And here we have a kind of dark side of Durkheim. Not that Durkheim is to blame for what I'm about to say. He stressed the normative solidarity within societies. People share values, they are attached to each other, and they conceive of themselves as part of the same social group. But the problem of that is it's a cage. Society is a cage, and it cages people into ignorance and lack of empathy for other peoples. And so we get persistent ignorance of the other side and contempt for the enemy, the belief that they are inherently weaker than we are. We find this over and over again. And rulers use kind of rather indirect measures of the other enemy. For example, when a Chinese emperor died, it was his wife, his widow, who took over power. And so the ex-barbarian neighbors attacked because they thought she would be weak. Well, what they didn't know, but should have known, was that she was already a general, and she led Chinese armies already. And she, in fact, defeated the Mongols in this case. But we find over and over again contempt for the enemy. If you think about Germany and Japan in World War II, they thought they were more martial. They had, kind of more, they could offset technological inferiority with their fighting spirit, fascism, etc. And the problem also is that all of the sides in wars generally are self-righteous. That is, they believe in the justice of their cause. And if you believe in the justice of your cause, you're more likely to have a certain contempt for the enemy, but you know what justice is and they don't. And there is also an ambiguity of fact and value in the word should, which is often used by rulers beforehand, which is we should win this. And that should has two different meanings. One is we should because we have the moral right, we are self-righteous, we have the morality behind us. But should also is a calculation of odds. We should win because we're stronger. And these two things get mixed up together. Say a little thing about the Ukrainian war. I was, dare I say, lucky enough about such a war that it happened just before I went to press with this book, so I was able to include it at the end, though I can't claim to have a deeper understanding of the war because I only had reference to the first 6 months before the book went to press. But it was a typical war of aggression. It bears out many of the things that we have seen. Now, Putin was provoked, and aggressors normally say that we were provoked. We're not the real aggressors because we were provoked. He was provoked by NATO expansion, and indeed he was. When Gorbachev was negotiating with the West, he agreed to the reunification of Germany on condition that NATO would not move any further east. And we have evidence of about 8 diplomats from the West saying that explicitly. But of course, NATO did not keep to that, which means the United States did not keep to that, and NATO was expanded to the borders of Russia. So it was a provocation. However, Putin was also contemptuous of Ukrainians. He explicitly said, and so did many other Russians, the Ukrainians were inferior and that they needed fascism because they couldn't stand up for themselves. They needed a leader and they didn't have one. He was also contemptuous of the United States because the US had had such a dismal record in international wars over the last 20, 30 years, whereas he had had a series of successes. Chechnya, Georgia, Syria, and Belarus and Kazakhstan. They didn't need war. They needed Russian protection in order to survive against popular movements. So that Putin has extended Russia to most of the population of the former Soviet Union. And so he's been very successful in that respect. And there's another page now, just happened most recently, that of Armenia and Azerbaijan, because behind the scenes, the Russians are ensuring that they are the great power protector of Azerbaijan. So that they have, as another area that they have returned to Soviet Union and former Tsarist imperial territories. Well, of course, Putin severely underestimated the fighting ability of the Ukrainians. He also failed to see that though the US had suffered all these defeats, they could arm the Ukrainians with no casualties, a proxy war. So it wasn't a shark against a minnow. It was a shark against a medium-sized fish protected by very large fish. Now, in this respect, we can see that the US and Russia, though not the Ukraine, US and Russia have had sequences of wars. And those experiences have baked in a degree of militarism into their culture and institutions. So they were predisposed to make war rather than to do deals. And of course there is this common self-righteousness about their claim to territories. Both sides think they have a right to the territories. Don't forget that Ukraine was in the Soviet Union, and it was kind of, in a way, semi-accidentally given a degree of autonomy. Well, it is a war of stalemate and attrition. I mean, Putin got it badly wrong, though he has occupied some new territories. It's a war that's impossible to predict the outcome. Many wars are like that, most wars are like that. Unless the US and NATO waver, and the one thing that we can perhaps see over the horizon is Trump coming back as President of the United States, committed to stop arming the Ukraine. I want to say something finally about atrocities. Russian atrocities in Ukraine consist of the slaughter of civilians. But that's normal in 20th and 21st century wars. Aerial bombing of civilian cities by all sides in World War II. Targeting civilians on the grounds that if you weaken their morale, they'll falter. Now, deliberate targeting. We've all done it. All the great powers have. Germany, Japan, Soviet Union, Britain, United States. All bombed cities. Of course, the British sent 5 bombs into Dresden, burned the city down. The Americans did the same thing in Tokyo, burnt the city down. So it's normal. Now I want to say something, add on something that from the other war that's going on at the moment, Israel and Palestine. There are two different kinds of killing, which Randall Collins has labeled ferocious killing and callous killing. Ferocious killing historically concerned direct body-to-body slashing. All right, it was direct body slashing, and there was direct slaughter of civilians in cities that had not surrendered immediately to the aggressor. As altered slightly, somewhat, with the appearance of guns. But then, the first guns, you could directly see the enemy, and you could pick targets, as bowmen had done earlier, archers, right? But callous warfare became the dominant form of warfare. So we have very good description of the dropping of the Hiroshima bomb by this crew of about, I think there were 4 or 5 Americans in that plane. And they put in their log, bombs delivered, mission completed, returning home. And afterwards, none of them have been troubled by moral qualms, because there's a big distance between them up there in that plane and the devastation down below in Japan. And we find callous killing since World War I. Our long-distance artillery has produced about 75% of the casualties in World War I. And World War II, where there is systematic air power, is a higher proportion. And so we have, the British bombers going into Germany. They drop their bombs, they turn around, come back. A few of them get shot down. But it's a kind of callous killing. Okay? Now, if we turn to the struggle that's going on right now, it's clear that Hamas has gone back to ferocious war, deliberately targeting individual civilians, and causing higher Israeli casualties than it has experienced before. But of course, Israel is responding by massive bombing. Long-range artillery is devastating and killing actually far more Palestinians. Now, it's nonetheless the case that we're more shocked by the ferocious body-to-body or direct firing of guns and cutting off decapitations and things. We're far more shocked by that than we are deaths by callous deaths inflicted from a distance by people who don't see their victim. But we shouldn't be. They are equivalent in the killing that they do. Killing is killing. Well, Ukraine war, the Palestinian-Israeli wars are clearly irrational, as most wars have been. And that's the norm in wars. And the final thought in terms of what's the moral of this? What's the moral of my book? Well, the moral is rulers should read it. Thank you.